The Lantern Witch of Briar Hollow. Briar Hollow lay where the hills folded inward like cupped hands, forming a valley that seemed perpetually suspended between dusk and night. The forest surrounding it was thick with ancient birches and black pines whose branches intertwined high above the narrow road that wound down from the northern ridge. Travelers rarely passed through the hollow anymore. The village had not vanished entirely, but it existed in a peculiar stillness, as though time had decided to slow its pace within those shadowed boundaries. Alistair Rowan arrived there on a gray evening in late autumn. He had not planned to visit Briar Hollow. His original destination had been a distant monastery known for its rare manuscripts, but a collapsed bridge along the mountain road had forced him to take an unfamiliar route through the valley. As a historian who specialized in folklore and forgotten traditions, Alistair was not displeased by the detour. Villages that existed beyond the usual maps often preserved stories that larger towns had long since abandoned. The road descended slowly between tall trees whose bark gleamed pale in the fading light. A thin fog gathered along the ground, drifting like breath across fallen leaves. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a lantern glimmered faintly between the trunks. Alistair assumed it belonged to a villager returning home. Yet, as his carriage rolled forward, the light moved farther into the woods rather than toward the road, slipping quietly between branches until it vanished altogether. By the time he reached Briar Hollow, evening had deepened into a subdued twilight. The village consisted of perhaps 24 stone houses clustered around a small square dominated by a dry well and a chapel with a narrow bell tower. Most windows glowed dimly with candlelight, though few figures appeared in them. The air carried a faint scent of smoke and damp earth. Alistair secured lodging at a modest inn, whose wooden sign creaked softly in the wind. Inside, the room was warm with firelight, though the atmosphere remained curiously subdued. The innkeeper, a reserved woman with graying hair pulled neatly back, greeted him with polite restraint. When Alistair mentioned seeing a lantern in the forest on his way down the ridge, her expression tightened slightly. "Travelers sometimes see lights among the trees," she said. "It is best not to follow them." Alistair raised an eyebrow with academic interest. "A local superstition?" "Perhaps," she replied, though her tone suggested something more deliberate than superstition alone. Later that evening, Alistair sat near the hearth with a notebook open on his knee. He had long believed that the most revealing stories were those people hesitated to tell. Briar Hollow clearly possessed such stories. As he listened to the wind brushing softly against the shutters, he recalled the lantern moving through the forest with an almost purposeful calm. The following morning, Alistair explored the village. Briar Hollow appeared older than it had first seemed. The houses were built of dark stone, fitted with patient craftsmanship, their roofs steep and weathered. Moss gathered along the edges of the square where grass had once grown. The chapel door remained closed, though its narrow windows glimmered faintly as though candlelight persisted within. When Alistair inquired about the lantern he had seen, the villagers answered cautiously. Some dismissed it with a shrug. Others simply changed the subject. Eventually, an elderly bookseller who operated a small shop near the square offered a fragment of explanation. "There is someone who lives beyond the hollow," the bookseller said quietly. "In the forest where the valley begins to rise again. A solitary woman who keeps a lantern burning each night." "A hermit?" Alistair asked. "Some call her a witch." The word did not carry the heated accusation often found in old trial records. Instead, it seemed spoken with a kind of uneasy respect. Alistair felt his curiosity sharpen. Stories of witches had fascinated scholars for centuries, yet few modern accounts contained anything beyond exaggeration. If Briar Hollow preserved a genuine tradition surrounding such a figure, he intended to document it. That evening he walked along the forest path leading toward the northern ridge. Twilight gathered quickly beneath the trees. The ground was soft with leaves, and the trunks rose like pale pillars around him. For a long while the woods remained silent except for the whisper of branches overhead. Then he saw the lantern again. It glowed warmly among the distant trunks, moving slowly along a narrow path that Alistair had not noticed before. Unlike the erratic lights sometimes caused by drifting marsh gas or wandering travelers, this lantern moved with steady deliberation. Its glow illuminated a slender figure walking through the forest. The figure wore a dark cloak that flowed gently behind her, and the lantern hung from a curved iron handle that caught the light with faint copper glints. Alistair did not approach immediately. Instead, he observed from a respectful distance, mindful that wandering unannounced into another person's dwelling rarely produced welcoming results. The lantern-bearer eventually disappeared behind a low stone wall, partially hidden by ivy. Beyond it stood a cottage unlike any structure within the village. The cottage appeared ancient, built from rough stones stacked carefully into rounded walls. Its roof curved downward in steep angles, layered with moss and dark slate. A tall chimney rose at one side, though no smoke drifted from it. The lantern-bearer reached the door and lifted the light slightly before entering. For a brief moment, the glow revealed a glimpse of her profile, pale and composed, framed by long dark hair. Alistair waited several minutes before stepping forward. He had no intention of intruding, yet the cottage itself fascinated him. Symbols were carved into the stone arch above the doorway, crescent shapes intertwined with branching lines that resembled vines or roots. They did not appear decorative. They seemed placed there with deliberate intention. "You have followed my lantern," a calm voice said behind him. Alistair turned slowly. The woman stood several steps away, holding the lantern in one hand. Her cloak moved lightly in the wind, and the amber glow illuminated the surrounding trees. Her expression was composed, neither hostile nor welcoming. "I hope my curiosity has not offended you," Alistair said. "I am a historian passing through Briar Hollow. The villagers spoke of you with caution. They often do." Her voice carried a quiet confidence that suggested long familiarity with such reactions. "May I ask your name?" Alistair said. "I am called Celine Vale." Alistair inclined his head politely. "Then you must forgive my boldness, Mistress Vale. Stories about lanterns in forests rarely resist scholarly inquiry." A faint smile touched her lips. "Stories rarely begin with the lantern. They begin with the valley." She gestured toward the surrounding hills. The trees seemed to lean inward as twilight deepened between their branches. "Briar Hollow was once a crossing place," Selene continued, "not merely for travelers, but for older currents that flow through the land. Those who understood them lived quietly and kept watch. My family has done so for generations." Alistair felt a quiet thrill of intellectual fascination. "You mean to say that the tradition of witches here is hereditary, if you wish to call it that?" Celine lifted the lantern slightly. Its glow revealed subtle carvings along the iron frame, symbols similar to those above the cottage door. "This lantern does not guide travelers," she said. "It marks a boundary." "A boundary between what?" Alistair asked. Celine looked toward the deeper forest where darkness thickened between the trunks. "Between what the world remembers and what it has chosen to forget." The words lingered in the cool air. Alistair found himself unexpectedly aware of how quiet the forest had become. Even the wind had stilled. Over the next several days, Alistair returned often to the cottage. Celine spoke sparingly but with clarity when he asked about the traditions of Briar Hollow. She explained that certain places in the world accumulated echoes of thought and intention across centuries. When such echoes gathered too densely, they required a keeper, someone capable of maintaining equilibrium between memory and silence. "Without a watcher," she said one evening as they stood beside the stone wall, "those echoes can disturb the living, not with violence but with confusion. Dreams become tangled, time feels uncertain. A lantern is sometimes enough to remind them where they belong." Alistair recorded her words carefully in his notebook, though he sensed that written language captured only fragments of what she meant. One night the forest fog thickened unusually early. The lantern's glow barely reached the surrounding branches. Celine stood quietly beside the path, listening to something Alistair could not hear. "It grows restless," she murmured. "What does?" he asked. "The valley's memory." She lifted the lantern higher, and the flame within flickered briefly before steadying. For a moment, Alistair felt an uncanny sensation, as though unseen currents moved through the trees around them, shifting like distant tides. "Do not be afraid," Celine said calmly. "It is only remembering itself." Gradually, the sensation faded. The fog thinned. The forest returned to its familiar hush. Alistair realized then that Briar Hollow's stories had never been meant as warnings about a witch in the woods. They were reminders that someone remained vigilant there. On his final evening in the valley, Alistair stood once more at the edge of the forest road. The lantern glowed steadily near the cottage gate, its light warm against the encroaching night. Celine watched him from beside the stone wall. "You will write about this place," she said. "I will write carefully," Alistair replied. "Good." She turned slightly, allowing the lantern's glow to illuminate the path leading deeper into the trees. "Most travelers seek roads that lead forward," she said quietly. "But some journeys exist only so that someone remembers the turning points." Alistair nodded. He understood that Briar Hollow would remain exactly as it was, half forgotten, quietly watched. As he departed along the ridge road the following morning, he glanced back toward the valley. The lantern was no longer visible, yet he knew it would appear again when twilight returned. Deep within the forest, beyond the village and beneath the patient branches of ancient trees, the lantern witch of Briar Hollow continued her silent vigil, keeping the boundary between memory and shadow where it had always belonged, illuminated by a single unwavering flame.